How you doing, folks? Falcher over there. Very welcome to tonight's lecture here at Tallaght Historical Society. Great to see you all looking so fit and well in this wonderfully wild and mild evening that it is at the moment out there. We'll promise more wildness, I think, during the night. Now, could just first of all mention a few housekeeping matters. Phones on silent, please. Got to do that to my own phone now in a second. We have Daryl here, Daryl Rooney here with us, bringing us a lecture tonight. Just to give you the title, my lecture title tonight is, listen for this one now, this is like the good old days. Incestuous, Cannibalistic and Barbaric. Gerald of Wales Depictions of the Medieval Irish. I was wondering why there's such a big crowd in here tonight. Definition of a Welshman, they always say, and the Welsh will tell you, an Irishman that can swim. Daryl is a first-year PhD student in the School of History at Trinity College Dublin. He earned his BA in English and History, as well as his MA in Medieval Studies at UCD. Don't know how you did that. Daryl's doctoral research examines how the Irish were constructed as other by medieval writers in Britain and on the continent in the 12th century. He is particularly interested in the application of modern psychological theories in the study of medieval identities. So without further ado, I'll give to you Incestuous, Cannibalistic and Barbaric, Gerald of Wales, Depictions of the Medieval Irish. Daryl Rooney, please.
Thanks, Ken. Apologies for that hiccup there at the start getting organised. As my girlfriend says, I'm technologically challenged, and that you can see there by the awkward formatting there in the slides. But anyway, before I begin, I just want to extend my thanks to the chair of the Tallaght Historical Society, Anne Hanrahan, and to Michael, he's here, who looks after the county library here, and his colleagues for facilitating this lecture series. So I suppose the purpose of this lecture here tonight was I spotted somewhat of a gap when I was attending these lectures in previous years and I suppose it follows the traditional trends in terms of popular history, is that it's mainly modern history that people are interested in. So I said, perhaps I'll give a lecture on medieval history. And in terms of, I suppose, bridging the gap, because I think one of the main issues in terms of relating to the Middle Age is that it can seem so different. By using Gerald of Wales as an example, I can show you that this man could be very well placed into modern society today. Gerald of Wales, also known as Giraldus Cambrensis in the Latin and Gerald de Barri in the French, was one of the most formidable members of the Geraldines or the Fitzgerald dynasty. He was a clergyman and a historian. The origins of the Fitzgerald dynasty lie in the immediate years of the invasion of Ireland in 1169 AD. When Maurice Fitzgerald, Gerald's uncle, accompanied the first contingent of Normans who arrived in Ireland after accepting Dermot MacMurchada's calls for help in regaining his throne. Dermot was deprived of his kingdom by the High King of Ireland, Ruaidhri y Conchobar, as he was accused of abducting Dermfergal, or Dervla, the wife of King of Breffni, Tiernan O'Rourke, in 1152. Little is known of Gerald's early years and upbringing, other than what he has told us in his autobiography, De Rebus a Segestis, or in the English, on his deeds, or about his deeds. He tells us that he undertook the equivalent of his secondary school education in the Benedictine Abbey of Gloucester, and then in 1162 he moved to Paris, where he would spend 13 years of his life perfecting his knowledge of the Latin poets and orators such as Cicero, and undertaking the study of law, philosophy and theology. In 1175 he returned to Wales and accepted the archdeaconship of Brecon. In 1183 he paid his first of 4 visits to Ireland, visiting his family who had held a chief role in the invasion years post 1169. In 1184 he became tutor to King Henry II's son, Lord John, and the following year in 1185 he accompanied Lord John on his expedition of Ireland. It was during this visit that Gerald set about collecting the information which he would include in his work, the Topography of Hibernica, or in the English, the Topography of Ireland. He tells us that once Lord John returned to Wales and England in the December of 1185, he spent until the following Easter pursuing his studies of Ireland, quote, more fully not merely gathering materials, but also setting them in order, end quote. In trying to understand the man, the familial aspect of Gerald's life is an integral piece of the Gerald puzzle. One only needs to look at the vast social network which his grandmother Nest formed in order to locate the basis for his internalised dichotomy of identities, which was created through Nest's royal endeavours, as well as her promiscuity, and led to her giving birth to several children, some legitimate, others not so. She was the only legitimate daughter of Rhys ap Tudor, the last king of Daybart, which was a Welsh kingdom, and her mother Gladys was the daughter of Rhiwallon ap Cynfyn of Powys, a Welsh king. As such, Nest had extensive familial ties to the old dynasties of Wales. However, her connections were far more extensive. She bore an illegitimate child to Henry I, namely Henry Fitzhenry. She married Gerald de Windsor, the first castellan of Pembroke Castle, through whom she became an ancestress and maternal progenitor of the Fitzgerald and Carew family of Molesford, Berkshire. With Gerald de Windsor, Nest had 5 children, including Maurice Fitzgerald, whom Gerald of Wales will come to memorialise in his Expugnatio Hibernica, or his invasion of Ireland. After Gerald de Windsor's death, Nest married his constable of Cardigan, Stephen, with whom she bore Robert Fitzstephen. As a result of these liaisons and marriages, Gerald of Wales was connected to a vast social network in which he held much currency. As such, one must be aware that Gerald was fraught with internalised dichotomies of allegiances between his Norman, Welsh and English connections. The need to look after these various groups, coupled with his desire for fame, ultimately led to his relative lack of success, certainly in his eyes, as he aimed to satisfy and garner the favour of one too many. Thus, when one examines Gerald, his familial identity is as important as any other. Gerald was undoubtedly internally conflicted and exemplified the popular idiom of eating one's cake and having it too. As the historian Michelle P. Brown notes, he was in turn a denigrator and champion of the Celtic peoples, from whom he claimed part ancestry, a sycophant and critic of kings and courts, an espouser of the militaristic feudal ideals of the martyr knights of Wales, from whose ranks he sprang, and a reforming idealistic cleric intent upon the unity of Christendom and the independence of the Welsh Church. Gerald's works have drawn a mixed reception of disdain and controversy, as well as admiration, from generations of readers, and are mostly remembered for his openly expressed chauvinism and his zealous approach towards justifying the endeavours of his kinsmen in Ireland. However, despite the fact that he is often taken to task, our knowledge of 12th century Ireland would be far more limited if not for Gerald's Irish works. In an article entitled Gerald of Wales, Norman Reporter on Ireland, the Irish historian F.X. Martin asserted that Gerald's work should not be scornfully thrust aside because he preened himself as artfully as any peacock on his qualities and achievements, but rather his Irish works should be examined for their carefully constructed and carefully argued accounts of the Cambro-Norman invasion. This evening I'm looking specifically at the Topographic Hibernica, which was the first work of Gerald's. Now, I was hoping to show you a resource, because I think the important thing, especially with Gerald's work, is that what's unusual about the Middle Ages is that there's such little evidence to go off. But in terms of having so many works, we have 8 extant works that were written by Gerald, and we can access them ourselves. So just for yourselves, I thought it might be an interesting opportunity. I'm going to go out of this and show you a website. Some of you may be familiar with this. This is called ISOS. It has no affiliation with the Islamic State, so fear not, it's isos.ie. ISOS is a project that's run... Oh no, tragic. Look up ISIS when you get home. Be careful of the spelling. And what you'll find is a project which is run by the Dublin Institute for Advanced Study in Ballsbridge, which has done a fantastic job of digitising essentially a good proportion, if not a majority, of manuscripts which deal with medieval Ireland and early modern Ireland. It has various collections, private and those held by museums and libraries in Ireland. On that website you can find the National Library of Ireland, and in their collection is manuscript number 700, which I'm going to be showing you some interesting, to say the least, images now in a second, but you can access them yourselves in your own time. So MS 700 contains both of Gerald's Irish works, namely the Topography of Hibernica and the Expugnatio Hibernica. In his edition of the Expugnatio, A.B. Scott has dated the manuscript 700 on textual and paleographical grounds, paleography being the study of medieval handwriting or medieval fonts, to around 1200, which was 12 years after the Topographia was first completed. The manuscript contains 99 folios and is written in 3 contemporary hands. The corrections and additions show that it was conceived as a single volume from the outset, as details such as the makeup of the quires, which is in the bindings of a manuscript, and indeed you see it in modern books today. If you take a look at the binding, you'll see the quires and quire coming from 4. They're in pages of 4. As well as the ruling, the page layout and the illuminations make this clear. And historians reckon that this manuscript was actually written for Gerald himself, but not written by Gerald. The Topographia is extant in 4 recensions or versions, with each recension being exemplified by numerous existing manuscripts. In addition, there are many later editions which have so far failed to be identified to specific recensions and the possible dates of composition. The popularity of the work is suggestive of the topographic genre more generally, a genre which provides an insight into the other. Now, what is the other? In philosophy and psychology, the other is a state of being different from and alien to the social identity of a person or group. Put simply, the terms other and otherness indicates the quality of being different. The term ethnography derives from the Greek words ethnos, meaning people, and graphe, which means a visual or written portrayal. The descriptions contained within Gerald's ethnographic work on Ireland would have an impact upon several subsequent generations and their perceptions of the Irish. But the problem lies within the veracity of his descriptions. The historian Thomas Wright stated that Gerald was evidently a zealous, if a rather credulous, observer and collector of facts. Gerald had observed the Irish while he visited Ireland. However, he also accounted for information which he heard from locals and his kin. In reference to previous accounts of Ireland, Gerald himself asserts, "Neither would it be strange if these authors sometimes strayed from the path of truth, since they know nothing by the evidence of their eyes, and what knowledge they possessed came to them through one who was reporting and was far away. For it is only when he who reports a thing is also one that witnessed it, that anything is established on the sound basis of truth." To call Gerald an observer does not pay heed, however, to the fact that he was not always accounting observable phenomena. This is not to say that there is no truth in Gerald's accounts, rather highlighting that a lack of apprehension and serious reflection upon his works results in misinformed readers who are more credulous than even Gerald himself. In Gerald of Wales 1146 to 1223 by the historian Robert Bartlett, he examined Gerald's ethnographic works comparatively against those of Anglo-Norman and French writers who had also addressed the subject of the Celtic peoples, and also of German writers who had provided ethnographic descriptions of the Scandinavians and Slavs. Bartlett showed that the parallels between the various writers' descriptions of the barbarian thus provided a, quote, "a more or less coherent image of the barbarian," end quote. Bartlett's suggestion that a coherent image of the barbarian existed is suggestive of a more widespread conceptualization of the other as being barbaric. Throughout the course of his Topographia, one garners a sense of the thoroughness in which Gerald constructs Irishness through each of its 3 distinctiones or parts. Part 1 addresses the titular topographical aspects of Ireland, as well as geography, the climate, as well as native flora and fauna. Part 2 focuses upon the so-called wonders and miracles of Ireland, including notable descriptions of Irish saints. And finally, Part 3 treats the inhabitants of Ireland. While it is the third part which dedicates itself explicitly to the inhabitants of Ireland, both preceding parts contribute to the overall depiction of the Irish, and in turn influences how one perceives the Irish in general. The Topographia exhibits a similar topical structure as did ethnographic accounts of antiquity, whereby several topics are addressed yet contribute to a unified description of a people. In the case of the Topographia, this functions to create a depiction of the Irish as being barbaric and uncivilized in almost all facets of their lives, and therefore in need of cultivation by the Cambro-Norman invaders. As each part of the work contributes to the overall image of the Irish, it is important to examine each of the 3 parts and explore how each contribute to Gerald's construction of Irishness. Gerald opens his Topographia with a preface to Henry II, referring to the Irish as quote-unquote secret and distant freaks. The perception of Ireland as being a distant land where nature has chosen a different course is a common theme in antique and medieval works, whereby the other is defined as being distant from the norm and by extension, the self. The first part of the Topographia sets the topographical and natural scene for the reader/audience. It is in this part that Gerald fixes the Irish to the landscape which they inhabit. By associating the Irish to a specific land, Gerald is making their existence more concrete and real, providing them with a locative identity. Moreover, he states that Ireland is, quote, situated in the Western Ocean about one short day's sailing from Wales, but between Ulster and Galloway in Scotland, the sea narrows to half that distance. Nevertheless, from either side, the promontories of the other can be fairly well seen and distinguished on a fine day, end quote. By describing Ireland's proximity right from the beginning of the work, Gerald is creating a sense of the Irish as being uncomfortably close to Wales and England. The narrower distance between the north of Ireland and Scotland suggests that the Irish could easily travel to Britain, heightening the concerns that a barbarian people might invade Wales and England from the north. By commenting upon Ireland's proximity, Gerald makes the arrival of the barbaric Irish to the shores of Britain seem like a possible threat, thus justifying a preemptive invasion. It is interesting then, despite their short distance from Wales, that it is their marginal geographic position which makes them barbaric, according to Gerald. Quote, since conventions are formed from living together in society, and since they are so removed in these distant parts from the ordinary world of men, as if they were in another world altogether, and consequently cut off from well-behaved and law-abiding people, they know only of the barbarous habits in which they were born and brought up, and embrace them as another nature, end quote. Ireland's supposed marginality has barbarised its inhabitants. However, it is interesting that it is their geographic position which has caused them to recede from civilised society, considering that the island of Britain is within proximity, as pointed out by Gerald himself. This calls into question the logic behind his construction of the Irish as a marginalised people. They are so close in terms of geographic position, yet so far in terms of cultural and social ideals. Moreover, Bartlett described Gerald as a child of a frontier society at the edge of feudal Europe. This calls into question not only how Gerald perceived himself and the points he used for arguing the barbarousness of the Irish, but also how people in modern times might draw upon logical thinking in order to justify their superiority over another people. Ireland has historically been seen as being located at the frontier of civilization. While Gerald was the first writer to write exclusively about the Irish, he was certainly not the first writer to mention the Irish and their marginality. The first certain and dateable extant reference to Ireland is found in Julius Caesar's account of his invasion of Britain in 54 BC. Caesar's reference rests solely upon Ireland's marginal location. Similarly, the 1st century Greek philosopher, geographer and historian Strabo, in his Geographia, spoke of Ireland's location as being at the northernmost boundary of the inhabitable world. If you were to travel not more than 4 stadia, according to Strabo, which is approximately 8 kilometres in today's measurements, north from the centre of Britain, you would find a region that is inhabitable only after a fashion. So this is a map according to Strabo, which is interesting. So you have Canada, which is effectively the African continent, but notice obviously there's no North or South American or Central American continent there. And this is the Erne, supposedly Ireland, and the triangle here. Here, Ireland is located north of Britain rather than to the west, highlighting the perception of Ireland and its people as being from a cold and miserable northern climate. By locating the Irish in the northernmost habitable place in the Oikomene being the known world for the Greeks, Strabo is perpetuating the concept that humanity is stunted by extreme cold. The Roman historian and politician Sallust in his Jugurtha begins his brief ethnographic account of Africa much akin to Gerald's account of the Irish, with a geographic description, which is accompanied by an allusion to the alternative opinions of Herodotus and the aforementioned Strabo regarding the division of the Earth's surface and its geography. The physical marginalisation of the other is discussed in reference to classical ethnographic descriptions by T.E.J. Weidemann, who asserts that such marginalised depictions act as a metaphoric means of reinforcing stereotypes by associating them with specific physical landscapes which the other is supposedly fixed to. Comparatively, in his Res Gestae, 4th century Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus described the Saracens as a wandering people with no fixed abode. Quote, "No man ever grasps a plough handle or cultivates a tree. None seeks a living by tilling the soil, but they rove continually over wide and extensive tracts without a home. Without fixed abodes or laws, they cannot long endure the same sky, nor does the sun of a single district ever content them." End quote. The Saracens' supposed proclivity for wandering and lack of endurance makes them a threat for the preservation of Rome, Roman identity and their ideals, because they lack a fixed abode and thus are more likely to invade Rome. One can see that both Ammianus and Gerald use the location of the other as a means of associating them with a sense of impending threat, due to either their proximity or their lack of a fixed abode. Moreover, Ammianus' description, which also addresses the economic aspect of Saracen society, is similar to that of Gerald's regarding the Irish. Gerald states, quote, "They have not progressed at all from the primitive habits of pastoral living. While man usually progresses from the woods to the fields and from fields to settlements and communities of citizens, this people despises work on the land. Little is cultivated and even less sown. The fields cultivated are so few because of the neglect of those who should cultivate them. He is too lazy to plant the foreign types of trees that will grow very well here." End quote. Laziness was a common trait commonly associated with barbarians. In the 12th century, it was widely known that the Celtic regions were fundamentally pastoral economies, and that it was conventional to see writers comment upon the absence of towns, commerce and agriculture in these regions. The 12th century historian William of Malmesbury was the earliest author to compare the economies of Ireland and England, remarking that the Irish lived in quote-unquote rustic squalor. However, as Gillingham notes, while what William of Malmesbury and Gerald were saying about the Irish pastoral economy was true to a certain extent, they had indeed exaggerated the extent to which Celtic peoples relied upon pastoral farming. Gerald's descriptions, which emphasise the liminal position of Ireland, are suggestive of the effects of classical thinking regarding climatic determinism upon one's psyche and the nature of, indeed, the Irish in Ireland. Climatic determinism was one of several theories which represented the relationship between the macrocosm of the universe and the microcosm of the human body. The 2nd century astronomer and geographer Ptolemy had divided the world into Arctic, temperate and tropical zones. Both the Arctic and tropical zones did not support human life, only the temperate zone did. The further a person or people lived away from the equator, the more uncivilized they were. Gerald explicitly notes this relationship between man and his environment in the introduction to his third part. Quote, "For a proper order seems to demand that after we have placed the land itself in the ocean and outlined its position and nature, as well as its characteristics from the point of view of the presence or absence of various living things, we should then treat of man himself as being the most worthy subject of our investigation, and on whose account we have treated of the other things. This intrinsic relationship between man and his environment is reminiscent of the popular saying, you can take a man out of X, but you can't take X out of the man. The topography and geography of Ireland are used to create an image of a land which is as bleak as it is fecund. Gerald describes the land as being fruitful, rich in fertile soil, and plentiful in harvest. However, the climate scuppers the use through quote-unquote unceasing rain, which we can probably still relate to. According to Gerald, Ireland suffers more quote-unquote storms of wind or of rain than any other. In fact, the frequent and violent winds over north by prevalence cause almost all of the trees in the west to bend in the opposite direction, according to Gerald, which is interestingly towards Britain. Once again, there is a sense that the barbarian Irish are directed towards Wales and England. And the economic landscape of Ireland is left to want as the Irish have failed to adequately utilise the land. Gerald stresses this with an allusion to Virgil. Ireland, as other countries, has bees that produce honey, but the swarms would be much more plentiful if they were not frightened off by the yew trees that are poisonous and bitter, and with which the island woods are flourishing. End quote. Here, Gerald notes that the relatively low number of bees is due to the yew trees, which are not conducive for large swarms, subsequently reducing honey-making production. Again, a latent questioning of the agricultural and commercial awareness of the Irish is being suggested by Gerald. One may propose that the classical episteme, or mode of acquiring knowledge, which was based upon difference, is exemplified through the examples of Gerald's ethnographic descriptions, which closely resemble classical sources. The I'm sure some of you are aware of Michel Foucault, which is well known in some critical theory circles, but he drew attention to this difference between the pre-classical episteme, or the mode of acquiring knowledge, which was based upon difference exemplified through the examples of mainly difference. But Foucault himself notes that the activity of the mind will no longer consist in drawing things together, in setting out on a quest for everything that might reveal some sort of kinship, attraction, or secretly shared nature within them, but, on the contrary, in discriminating, that is, establishing their identities. And in this sense, discrimination imposes upon comparison the primary and fundamental investigation of difference. One can certainly see this classical mode of knowledge acquisition within Gerald's descriptions of the Irish, as it is difference which grounds the image of the Irish in his Irish works. One can argue whether the pre-classical or classical episteme is more conducive to negative views and stereotyping of the other. But aside from questioning the mode of thinking on Gerald's part and the associated tendencies to conclude either positively or negatively about a people, John Gillingham asserts that there was in fact difference between the English and the Irish in the 12th century. It was not concocted by Gerald. However, while this difference existed and many of Gerald's observations were true to a certain extent, they are often grossly exaggerated in order to justify the denigration of the Irish, the extirpation of their culture, and the invasion of their land. One cannot definitively state whether Gerald had read these works or not himself, as I'm afraid to say he was a terrible plagiariser, but he certainly he avoided mentioning where he gained his information from, and for him it was more important for, if someone was reading this, especially of the learned class, if they were learned enough, they would recognise the biblical allusions or classical allusions themselves, so he didn't have to give any indication. He wouldn't do too well in the university system, certainly today. One can suggest that Gerald's predilection for classical learning is sufficient to propose that he was influenced by these classical descriptions by some means, be it literary, oral, or both. Gerald was concerned with his intellectual fortitude in the sense that he was preoccupied with a desire for obtaining a renowned level of erudition, to be a thinker above his contemporaries. One cannot argue that he was adeptly versed in classical learning and canon law. However, despite his vanity, one cannot help feel a sense of intellectual insecurity on Gerald's part. As such, one might understand his need for recognition and fame as being exemplified in his regular use of literary allusions and references. The requisite references and allusions to past literature are indicative of a form of literary tradition, which one may argue continues to the present day. This form of literary tradition reflects an image of erudition in the breadth of knowledge on show. Gerald, ever self-conscious, creates an image of himself as a polymath through his classical and biblical allusions, which signify his knowledge of the Latin writers as well as theology. The recognition of certain biblical allusions holds various functions for Gerald's readership. The reader may or may not recognise an allusion or reference, which would depend on various factors such as literacy and type of education. For the appropriate reader, the nod to a biblical passage, or indeed a reference, would spark a sense of mutual understanding between Gerald, his audience, or reader. And Gerald notes himself that these references were incorporated mainly for the clergy, which he referred to as being the most preeminent and strong in learning. In his De Rebus, as I guess this, which is his autobiography, which I mentioned earlier on, he tells us, for he, referencing himself, reasoned on civil and canon law in such a lively fashion, and so enhanced his exposition with all the persuasions of rhetoric, and adorned it with figures and flowers of speech, as well as with profound argument. Doesn't half love himself, this gentleman. And made such apt use of the sayings of the philosophers and other authors by the wondrous art with which he applied them to appropriate topics, that the more learned and expert his audience, the more eagerly and attentive they applied their ears and minds to drink in his words and fix them in their memory. Gerald was conscious of his approach and the influence that classical references and allusions would have upon a learned audience. His desire to project an image of himself as being erudite is again represented by the fact that by the time of his death, the Topographia had almost doubled in length. The added material contained more symbolisms and moral didacticisms, as well as accounts of other countries. Essentially, quote, indiscriminate erudition of all kinds, as John J. O'Mara remarked. Moreover, Dimmock noted that the added material in it had about, quote, as much to do with Ireland and its people as with the moon and the man in it, end quote. In the second part of the Topographia, Gerald uses an array of myths and wonders to craft his ideal of Irishness. Gerald describes the Irish as both bestial and human, that is, half-breeds, but more specifically, cultural half-breeds. The following description from the third part of the Topographia illustrates this. They are a wild and inhospitable people. They live on beasts and live like beasts. They have not progressed at all from the primitive habits of pastoral living. Here, Gerald is referring to the development of human societies and how primitive habits abide in certain peoples and their associated lands. Bartis has commented that, quote, the concepts behind this passage would not be out of place in 19th century anthropological thought, nor are they complete strangers in the 20th century. Moreover, one can also see a comparison between the supposed primitive traits of the other in the descriptions of the new peoples of the New World, which was navigated by European explorers such as Christopher Columbus. Furthermore, one can see the paradoxical rhetoric used in his description of the Irish. They are, quote-unquote, people, yet live on beasts and live like beasts. T.E.G. Weidemann, who I mentioned earlier on, explored how Ammianus Marcellinus used the idea of the cannibal to construct antithetical identities which were used to create an ideal Roman identity. The differences in diets between people was a common point for concern for the civilized, as the other supposedly dined on human flesh. Gerald describes the Irish in bestial terms, and as such, when the Irish dine on beasts, they are by extension eating of the same flesh, that is, implying cannibalism. Strabo, who I've mentioned previously, spoke of the Irish as cannibals in a far more explicit way, asserting that they were man-eaters, who ate their dead fathers and had intercourse with their mothers and sisters. The 4th century Roman poet Prudentius, now you can see how appropriate my title it's not true. The 4th century Roman poet Prudentius referred to the Irish as, in the Latin, semi-forscotus, or the half-bestial Irishman who was worse than a war dog. This notion of hybridity is also found in the Topographia, illustrated by the description in the second part of a man that is half an ox and an ox that is half a man. This fine fellow here to the left, God love him, as well as the account of sexual relations between a tame goat and a woman, which you can see depicted here on the right. So this, unfortunately I couldn't show you ISOS, but if you go onto ISOS and you go onto the NLI, the National Library of Ireland, this manuscript NS 700, which I mentioned earlier, is there, and you can access the exact same images in the same quality, and it's a fantastic resource to just see, I suppose, the extent to which people who constructed this were of bringing together the sense of Irishness, but not only through text but also through image. Gerald, furthermore on this note about the tame goat and a woman, Gerald was certainly not a feminist, and more in line with the Trumpian attitudes associated with the current President of the United States of America. This image here is in fact of a woman. Gerald notes, Duvanaldus, the king of Limerick, had a woman that had a beard down to her waist. She had also a crest from her neck down along her spine like a 1-year-old foal. I don't know whether anyone has experience with 1-year-old foals, I don't, but I'll take his words for it. It was covered with hair. This woman, in spite of these two enormities, was nevertheless not a hermaphrodite and was in other respects sufficiently feminine. She followed the court wherever it went, provoking laughs as well as wonder. She followed neither her fatherland nor nature in having a hairy spine, but in wearing her beard long. She was following the custom of her fatherland, not her nature, i.e. her sex. In general, Gerald did not see women in a positive light and had quite pejorative things to say about them. When accounting the abduction of Dermot MacMurchada's wife, he asserts that it was her own fault, since woman is always a fickle and inconstant creature, supposedly, but I don't believe. However, it is important to note that most of medieval writings contain an inherent gender bias in any case, and do not adequately reflect the demographic realities of the Middle Ages. The notion of hybridity with regards to the Irish reflects a more common literary convention which serves to denigrate the other and remove their human status. The presence of a hybrid character or characters holds a specific literary function, which is often didactic or instructive, whereby a moral lesson is being taught. Gerald describes an account of an Irish abbot, namely Natalis, who has cursed a man and a woman, turning them into wolves. But unlike werewolves, they have retained their rationality and their mind, rather they have just taken the physical form of a wolf. By the time the Topographia had reached which translate in English to English, but it's not the. He saw himself very much as being 3/4 Welsh, but also as being quite pronounced. He's a Cambro-Norman. The relationship between monsters or grotesque mutilated beings and barbarians is based upon the classical Greek roster of barbarian traits, which include strange diets, customs, alternative social and or political structure, paganism and sexual excess, to name but a few. The art historian Deborah H. Strickland has noted that these traits were commonly applied to Celts, Slavs and Scandinavians, as well as the Ethiopians, Jews, Muslims and Mongols. No one's exempt. In the third part, Gerald speaks of the mutilated Irish, stating that just as there are Irish who are quote-unquote kindly fashioned by nature, there are equally those who quote-unquote turn out in a horrible way. He continues by asserting that it is not surprising that they turn out this way considering their adultery, incestuousness and horrible practices, and concludes, quote-unquote, it seems a just punishment from God. While Gerald speaks of the Irish generally, he also provides accounts of individual Irish people. In the second part, Gerald dedicates the final chapters to Irish saints, including Saints Iver, Coleman, Kevin and Bridget. It is interesting that Gerald speaks quite favourably about these saints, describing accounts of the miraculous capabilities of their relics, and even refers to Bridget as the glorious Bridget. Quote, just as the men of this country are during this mortal life more prone to anger and revenge than any other race, so in eternal death the saints of this land that have been elevated by their merits are more vindictive than the saints of any other region. End quote. Gerald once again harks back to the idea that while the Irish may have some admirable qualities, they are still flawed, including the Irish saints, despite their quote-unquote merits. Gerald's use of the Irish hybrid serves to provide the reader or audience with a figure which is simultaneously human and inhuman. The use of the hybrid figure allows Gerald to engage his didacticism through teaching the nature of orthodoxy and the potential divine retribution which will be enacted upon those who refuse to assimilate. Gerald uses religion as a platform for not only defining the ideals of the English and Welsh ethnicities, but he also uses religion to vilify the Irish and reduce their beliefs to heresy. His denigration of the Irish allows him to provide his own interpretation of the correct form of religious doctrine and belief. For example, he does not approve of the Irish belief in Old Testament doctrine in relation to marriage. Quote, they do not avoid incest. Moreover, and this is surely a detestable thing, and contrary not only to the faith, but to any feeling of honour, men in many places in Ireland, I shall not say marry, but rather debauch the wives of their dead brothers. They abuse them in having such evil and incestuous relations with them, in this wishing to imitate the ancients more eagerly in vice than in virtue. They follow the apparent teaching and not the true doctrine of the Old Testament. End quote. The Old Testament law, based on the Hebrew law Hoc Hayebum, relating to the marriage of a man to his brother's widow, was followed for over a millennium. However, by the time Gerald addresses the Irish adherents to it, there was already profound hostility surrounding the nature of Christian orthodoxy on the Isles and across the continent. While Gerald was critical of the Irish practice of Christianity, his account of Welsh marriage customs and sexual practices are equally damning. The native secular laws of Ireland, the Brecon laws, permitted polygamy and divorce, which was in direct conflict with canon law. Apologies. the process of major ecclesiastical reform, which is associated with the Irish Church in the 12th century, had its genesis in the late 11th century with the appointment of Gilpatrick of Worcester to the Dublin See. The reforming bishops who had been appointed in the wake of the Synod of Cashel in 1101 aimed to improve the existing church rather than to destroy it and remake it, as the historian Kathleen Hughes has remarked. As such, there was an existing reform occurring within the Irish Church, which Gerald fails to adequately mention as it does not fit his orthodoxy. The desire to promulgate the orthodoxy of the Church influenced the composition of ethnographic works in the Middle Ages, which can be seen in the Topographia. Gerald's desire to disseminate orthodoxy across Wales and Ireland reflects the Christian imperative of conversion and ultimately the elimination of difference. However, this elimination of difference was a desired outcome only when secular culture impinged upon religious issues, and in any case, internal conflicts and controversies within the church at the time were more pressing. Because Christianity reached Ireland hundreds of years before Gerald wrote about the Irish, it meant that he was clearly puzzled as to the lack of a true spiritual conversion. As such, this may explain the lack of extensive descriptions of St. Patrick and his endeavours, as Gerald wanted to start anew with what he perceived as a true orthodoxy of the Church. Furthermore, the historian James Muldoon asserts that the Irish puzzled Gerald because, quote, having been converted centuries ago to Christianity, they should have become as civilised as the English or the Anglo-Saxons understood civility, because Christianity and civility, though distinct qualities, went hand in hand, end quote. In the 8th century, the cleric and historian Bede also used the Irish as a platform for self-definition in his Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, or his ecclesiastical history of the English people. However, for Bede, the Irish were used as the standard for religious orthodoxy and were addressed far more positively than Gerald's descriptions 400 years later. Bede highlighted the fact that the Irish ecclesiastics and scholars had had a profound impact upon the dissemination of the faith in Britain. He even referred to the Irish as, quote, a harmless race that had always been most friendly to the English, end quote. Bede does get a mention in the first part of the Topographia when he is mentioned as being incorrect in his assertions about the presence of vineyards in Ireland. But beyond this mentioning, Gerald does not mimic or seek inspiration from any of Bede's favourable statements on the Irish. In contrast, the French abbot Bernard of Clairvaux and his Life of Malachy is representative of the descriptions which serve to vilify the barbarous Irish. Bernard opens his Life of the Saint Malachy with the following, quote, our Malachy was born in Ireland of a barbarous tribe. There he was brought up and educated, yet he betrayed not a mite of his rude origin, any more than a fish of the sea preserves a salty savour. How delightful it is that crude barbarism should have given us such a worthy man, a fellow citizen with the saints and a true member of the house of God, end quote. It is interesting that Bernard asserts that despite being born of a barbarous tribe, Malachy became a saint and quote-unquote a true member of the house of God, implying that despite his barbarous background, he was capable of good. It is worth noting that Gerald makes no mention of Malachy in his Topographia, perhaps due to the fact that it would have reduced the sense of Irish depravity and barbarity which had been asserted throughout the work. While it is true that Gerald is quick to vilify the Irish, he also describes the Irish in more positive terms and descriptions. He refers to their natural qualities, stating, quote, as if to prove what she, nature, can do by herself, she continually shapes and moulds, until she finally forms and finishes them in their full strength with beautiful bodies and handsome and well-complexioned faces, end quote. This description suggests that the Irish are well endowed by birth, through nature's graces, but are corrupted and barbarised by their society. Gerald continues, but although they are fully endowed with natural gifts, their external characteristics of beard and dress and internal cultivation of the mind are so barbarous that they cannot be said to have any culture. Gerald's description is carefully constructed. The Irish are well endowed by birth, but their society has corrupted them. As such, they are a people who need the correct form of cultivation, that is, through the guidance of the English and Gerald's kinsmen. Illuminating the Irish barbarian, Gerald's depiction of the Irish employs far more than words in order to construct the other. While words have the power to evoke mental images in the minds of readers and audiences, physical images, specifically these manuscript illuminations, invited greater impact. The illuminated MS 700 of the National Library of Ireland contains both the Topography and Expugnatio, both of which are accompanied by numerous interesting illustrations which depict many of Gerald's descriptions. These illustrations provide intriguing opportunities for examining the construction of the Irish in Gerald's works. Comparing the images of the Irish with those of the Cambro-Normans affords telling insights into the construction of the self and the Irish other. The image of the barbarian Irish, accompanied by axes in Manuscript 700, illustrates their contemptible nature. I particularly like this one. It looks like the two lads have just come out of the pub and the lad on top is a bit inebriated and he's giving them a lift home. But the image of the barbarian Irish, accompanied by axes in MS 700, illustrates their contemptible nature. The relevant text states, quote, "Wherever they, the Irish, go, they drag this, their axe, along with them. When they see the opportunity and the occasion presents itself, this weapon has not to be unsheathed as a sword, or bent as a bow, or poised as a spear." Gerald uses weapons and dress as a platform for comparing the barbarity of the Irish with the civility of the English. The physical appearance of the Irish in the Illumination reflects that of the barbarian, long hair and beard, which is they're unkempt and unruly. Moreover, the Roman statesman Cassiodorus, in his etymology, stated that the Latin word barbarus originated from the Latin words barba, meaning beard, and rus, which is flat land. The bearded Irish depicted within the text and the Illuminations are certainly representative of Cassiodorus' description. Gerald speaks of the Irish garments with the same disdain which he holds throughout most of his descriptions. They use very little wool in their dress, and that itself nearly always black, because the sheep of that country are black, and made up in a barbarous fashion. The historian Sherry N. Peters briefly discusses Gerald's description of Irish dress, suggesting that if the garments were in fact black, it was not a result of being comprised of black wool, as black sheep were actually very rare at the time. Rather, they were likely darkened with a natural colouring, which originated either from bogs, or vegetables darkened with urine, which was a commonly used mordant at the time, or the barks of trees, for example, the elder and oak. In contrast, the Illuminations accompanying the text of the Expugnatio exemplify the difference between the civility of the Cambro-Normans, exemplified with the illumination of Gerald's uncle, Maurice Fitzgerald, which unfortunately I was hoping to show you via ISOS, but I can't, but you'll just have to believe me here what I'm saying. Exemplified with the illumination of Gerald's uncle, Maurice Fitzgerald, and the barbarity of the Irish. The image of an Irishman with one foot atop a grounded man here on the right, while holding an axe, which is embedded into the said man's skull, illustrates the treachery of the Irish, as one may infer that the grounded individual is kin, or at the very least, a fellow Irishman, due to the similar clothing in which both men are wearing. The illumination of his uncle Mauritius, you can find this yourself when you go home tonight, and I'm sure you're all going to look at Bisos when you go home. If you go into MS 700, in the latter folios of it, you'll see his own kinsman depicted, clean shaven, short hair, all carrying swords, which is interesting. So his uncle Mauritius is well groomed with a shaven face and short tidy hair, which is in stark contrast obviously to the long haired and bearded barbarian Irish, dressed in a cloak which can aptly hide an axe. As Gerald states above, axes do not need to be sheathed, and therefore no prior warning is given to those who are about to be attacked. As such, the illustration suggests two polar opposite concepts of militaristic demeanours, one of cowardice and secrecy, the other of decency, composure and honour. There was undoubtable difference between what Gerald perceived to be the civilisation of his kinsmen and that of Irish society. However, while it is widely understood that the differences between ethnic groups can be overcome for the betterment of humanity, that is not always the case. For Gerald of Wales, difference would ultimately receive the social, cultural, economic and intellectual advances which Christianity had afforded Western Europe. As such, he had to respond through the methodical construction of the barbarian Irish other. Gerald of Wales was one of the most influential men of the Middle Ages. To this day, our knowledge of 12th century Ireland depends on Gerald's histories. His Topographia and his Expugnatio would influence how the Irish would be perceived across Britain, and indeed the wider European continent, for centuries after he died in 1223 at the age of 77. In the Topographia's preface to King Henry II, Gerald states, quote, "I decided to send to your highness those things rather which cannot be lost, By them I shall, through you, instruct posterity, for no age can destroy them. In retrospect, this quote seems strangely foreboding when one thinks of the impact of the Topographia upon the social, cultural and political landscapes of late medieval and early modern Ireland. As the 17th century historian Geoffrey Keating notes in his relation to the anti-Irish writings of Edmund Spenser and Richard Stanihurst, quote, "Every one of the new Gauls who writes on Ireland writes in imitation of Cambrensis, because it is Cambrensis who is the bull of the herd for them for writing the false history of Ireland. Wherefore they had no choice or guide." End quote. One must remember that the use of Gerald's works by several subsequent generations was exactly his intention. From its inception, Gerald had intended the Topographia to be disseminated widely and for it to be an abiding source of didacticism and instruction for posterity. His desire for it to be a lasting source was undoubtedly successful and exemplified by the fact that there are more extant manuscripts of the Topographia than all of his other works combined. Gerald's construction of the Irish other in the Topographia is an extensive process of denigration, beginning with their physical geographic location, their supposed laziness, lack of commerce, hybridity, cannibalism, incestuousness, different dress, and ending finally with their supposed failure to abide by the true doctrines of the Church. The fact that the real and the imaginary were blended together in such an intimate fashion in the Topographia led to misrepresentations of a barbaric Irish people who were incestuous, cannibalistic and ignorant of the rudiments of the faith, thus justifying the invasion. The Welsh historian R.R. Davies noted that, quote, "The creation of these stereotyped images are of great interest in the study of the mentality of domination. As so often with such images, they tell us as much, if not more, about the world of the image makers, as much as about the societies they're attempting to characterise. The images created as they were by an ecclesiastical and intellectual elite speak to us of a Europe where a set of international norms was being established." End quote. Gerald's construction of the Irish other was extensive and ultimately created an abiding image of an unruly, ignorant and inhuman people who were located merely across the pond. Thank you.
Any questions, folks? In that last slide there, I thought that the chap on the ground there getting his head split open, he looks like the guy who's being carried on the back in the first.
I wonder which happened first, chicken or the egg.
There's even more treachery involved. Certainly the chap with the axe looks like the chap who's
Down below, yeah.
You think so?
Yeah. But they have a moustache on the one on the right, yeah. Maybe not. Yeah, that's true.
It's very like him.
Is that how hurling started?
In some counties.
Slashers.
An awful lot of it sounded like stuff from, say, National Socialism from the 20th century, like in the complete running down of a race of people, the habits, their culture, the way they behave and all. In other words, they'd be subhuman.
Subhuman, and I mean, it's something that I suppose one of the main endeavours really of this lecture was just to show that as an era, I mean, the people of Middle Age were no less primitive in their thinking and their understanding than we are today. And I mean, I mentioned it in the lecture, but that process of denigration of another people's, or to dehumanise them, it's so extensive, and I just find it, I mean, psychologically speaking, very interesting, because it's the continuity, and it just shows that, I mean, we're not so different looking from now, going back even to, I know it's Gerald of Wales, but even going back to saying antiquity, when I mentioned those few classical sources, it is very interesting. Yeah. Yes, sir?
Is it seen as a work of propaganda now?
Now?
How is it seen, yeah?
It's seen now. Interestingly, as I mentioned earlier, F.X. Martin, the great Irish historian and medievalist, it was always seen as a work of propaganda, and this work would certainly still be seen as a propagandist work. What's interesting is that I was going to suggest to Anne later on afterwards, but accompanied in MS 700, his other work, the Expugnatio, or the Invasion of Ireland, is a much more historical account of the events of the invasion of Ireland and the endeavours of his kinsmen, whereas this is a much more, I suppose, explicitly ethnographic work and an act of propaganda to really, I suppose, in short,
the understanding of this was that it was there primarily, first and foremost, to justify the invasion of Ireland by his kinsmen, really. Now, I mean, we've come a long way in our relations between our close neighbours over on the other island beside us. So scholars are looking at it in a far more objective way than historians previously. But it's interesting, actually. There's some people see Gerald's works as being researched to death. But the interesting thing is that it's mainly his Topographia which has, I suppose, garnered the attention of many scholars. But he has very much other interesting works. He has a book called Speculum Duorum, which translates as The Mirror of Two Men, and that started off really interestingly as his nephew Gerald. In his later years, he was in the 70s at this stage, but his nephew was essentially trying to come up in the world, and in order to do that, he made his uncle Gerald out to be a senile old gossip within the communities within Wales. Some of you here are probably saying, good on your nephew Gerald, he deserved it. But the interesting thing is that in rebuttal, Gerald penned this letter, which started out as a rebuttal to his nephew, but which turned into a much larger, I suppose, numerous letters to the people who he felt had done him ill or done him wrong across his life. And that's a very interesting work, because there's one point in that where he had previously given a gentleman by the name of William a copy of his work, and he had fallen out essentially with William in his later life, and he pens this letter essentially saying, I was good enough to give you that work all those years ago, I want to return immediately. So I think it's just in terms of, we're lucky that we have access to his works, and so many of them. I mean, there's 8 there. I was going to put a list of them up, but certainly if you want, my details are there, but feel free to, catch me after the lecture. I'll stick around for a while, or contact me on my email address. I'll be happy to share any resources with you or any information. And I'm sure if you're interested in the topography, because I really just skimmed the surface in terms of giving examples. There's so much there from the topography. There is a penguin edition of it, which has been translated by John J. O'Mara, and I'm sure it should be in the library. So don't be all in a rush to pick up the hand to try and take it out alone. But yes.
If you don't mind me saying so, I wonder, are we going too far in denigrating this man? Because it seems to me, even though it's uncomfortable to think it, that a lot of what he says or wrote rings true even today.
Yeah.
We are by nature quarrelsome people, our history has been like that. We have been lazy as regards cultivating the land. Even today, drives to Ireland, a stranger would say, it's not cultivated
Enough, yeah.
Morally, the church, as you say, felt the need to reform itself at the time. We ourselves evidently felt that we needed improvement. So we can't just sort of say it was all like National Socialism propaganda. Basically, you seem to be saying that we were physically good, but we just weren't as advanced a civilization as it is today.
Yeah.
Well, maybe that's true.
No, I hope I made that clear in some way, that scholars do maintain that what he is saying is true to a certain extent. It's just how he embellishes the stories, but as he refers to himself, those kind of flares of speech and those, I suppose, hyperbole, exaggerations. But I did mention, that he is positive towards the Irish in ways, and what I did note there. But he loved Irish music, and he mentions in the Topographia that even in Wales, which he had a great fondness for Wales, but the music there was in no way comparable to Irish music. Yeah, so there you go. But the interesting thing is, he only managed to visit during his lifetime the east coast of Ireland during his four visits, which is in line with obviously the penetration of the Cambro-Normans. So he never visited the great trad music counties of Kerry and on the west coast. So he would have been in for a treat there.
He has cleared the main shipping south, been into Wexford or somewhere.
Yeah, on his first occasion he actually came in via Wexford. Actually, on 3 before he came in, and then through Dublin on another. But yeah, no, and the interesting thing in the Expugnatio, which
When he's published, or anyone from the monasteries or
we don't have any evidence, is the unfortunate thing. In terms of actual contemporary evidence, we don't have any. But there was a huge rebuttal from Catholic Irish against Gerald's works, and this was Geoffrey Keating was one of those writers who came out very explicitly to really speak out against Irish works, to show that the Irish were a very cultured and a very forward-thinking civilization, going back to antiquity and using even older sources. So yeah, there's certainly in the modern period, in the early modern period and the late Middle Ages, there is some rebuttal. But the unfortunate thing is, I'm sure that people weren't happy. But the other thing is, we have to remember that these works were disseminated first in England. So the Topography, when it was finished in 1188, 89, it was actually read out at the court in Oxford, which is interesting, by Gerald himself. And the interesting thing is that he read out the 3 parts on 3 different days, really 1 part on each day, and to a specific audience. So 1 part was read to essentially the common folk or peasants in the court of Oxford, another to essentially the man between the peasant classes and the literate classes, and then on the final day, he addressed solely the learned scholars. He tells us that in his autobiography, but the interesting thing is that he doesn't tell us which part. Now, I would assume perhaps that it was probably in the order in which it was written. But I can imagine that it received great interest as an ethnographic work in the UK when it was read.
It's just interesting there on his take of weather. Like global warming.
Hasn't changed much, Jeez, don't tell Donald Trump about Gerald of Wales. God, jeez.
And it was Asher's.
The actual manuscripts, they weren't. Somebody else did the writing of those.
Yes.
Yeah.
They're written. Well, that one wasn't written by Gerald himself. Now, that was written by 3 different contemporary hands in and around 1200s. The Topography is written in the one hand.
So he would be dictating them.
He would have had a master copy. You can see where it's been ruled on the manuscript, which is really interesting. So you can see on the side in the columns here, and alongside, and these what are called punctus in Latin, are punctures. They dictated where the line. So it's a bit like when you're in school and you're told you have to use the ruler and go across the page yourself, because this is what's been done here, and that's why you can see the whole work is written in 2 columns throughout the entire work. I believe it's 33 lines. I won't count, but it's 33 lines, but it just gives a sense, this website, of the size, the scale. It gives you a sense of how it's actually been constructed, the manuscript itself. So it's really interesting. Now, the unfortunate thing is, on some of the illuminations, I think you can see it here with that lovely woman there, but here the way the ink has faded as well. So in terms of codicology is the term given for looking at manuscripts in terms of their production. Paleography is the name given to the study of the text itself in terms of the handwriting. But you can see even here where there's holes in the vellum, in the skin, throughout the works. And I mean, there must be, I mean, at this stage, thousands of manuscripts there. Now the interesting thing you can also have a look at, now I didn't, for the purpose of this lecture, I didn't include them, but I mentioned earlier that there's a huge amount of the topographia still in existence, but not all of them have the accompanying pictures. And you can see that as well online for free. And they're actually the same images, but drawn by someone else. And the pigments are different on the dyes.